Hello, this is Geoff with In-Depth Studies. This is Geoff's thoughts on Romans. And today we're looking at chapter 1 of Romans, verse 2. Context is the gospel. And Paul says, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Now, this needs a little bit of explanation, and we need to turn to Galatians chapter 3, verse 8. And so I will read that, where Paul says regarding Abraham, he says, Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham, quote, all nations will be blessed through you. So this is the revealing that the gospel would go out to the world. But of course, Abraham is approximately 2000 BC. And of course, the gospel really doesn't go out to the world until beginning with Pentecost. So it's quite a few years that it took to go out. And this brings us to an interesting point that we need to understand, is that the Old Testament, and by that I mean both the patriarchal period, that is book of Genesis primarily, and the Old Covenant era, which is Mount Sinai to the cross, that this encompasses all of the Old Testament and beyond. But this was not the time for believing. This was the time for preparing for the Messiah and illustrating the work of the Messiah, which is why even the gospel message is not clear in the Old Testament, whether the patriarchal period or the Old Covenant era. And identifying who's a real believer, how, or what, example like Abraham in Genesis 15, he was promised an heir by the Lord, which is wonderful, but it says he was justified by his response of believing God, taking God at his word. And from our point of view, that doesn't sound like the gospel. But of course, salvation in the Old Testament is a bit of a mystery, like David, but really the announcement that the time for believing is going to be from Pentecost to the second coming. And that, I think, is what Paul is referring to when he says the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Thanks so much. If you want to check out more of Geoff's thoughts, you can check them out on YouTube. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.